A millionaire pretended to be asleep one quiet evening to test the honesty of his black maid's little daughter, and froze the moment he saw what she chose to do. The safe in his office stood wide open, spilling out neat bundles of cash, more money than most people would ever see in a lifetime. Thomas Mitchell, a self-made millionaire at 45, sat slouched in his oversized leather chair, eyes half shut, breathing slow and steady. To anyone looking, it seemed he had drifted into a nap after a long day of work. But Thomas wasn't sleeping. He was watching closely, waiting to see if human decency still existed in the world. It had only been a few weeks since he discovered one of his most trusted business partners had stolen nearly $3 million from the company. The betrayal hit him harder than he expected. Trust, once broken, was difficult to restore. After spending 2 decades building a business empire brick by brick, he found himself doubting whether anyone could ever be truly honest. He needed proof, evidence that not everyone was motivated by greed. And so he devised a test. That evening, the office clock struck 9 as the familiar sound of keys jingled at the door. Diana Jefferson, his quiet but diligent night cleaner, stepped inside. She had worked at his company faithfully for nearly 2 years. By her side was her 6-year-old daughter, Jasmine, a bright-eyed little girl who often accompanied her during school breaks. It wasn't that Diana had no other options. She simply refused to leave her daughter at home alone or in an unsafe environment. She brought Jasmine everywhere, and Thomas, though he never admitted it aloud, admired her commitment as a mother. Jasmine wore her usual pink gloves that night, a small pair Diana had bought so her daughter would feel helpful during their long hours of cleaning. The gloves were slightly oversized, but Jasmine proudly wore them anyway, adjusting them as though she were about to perform important work. Thomas's plan was simple. Leave the safe open with more money than most adults could resist and wait. If even a child, someone with innocent curiosity, took something, then maybe he had been right all along. Maybe honesty really was a thing of the past. Diana quietly began dusting the shelves, humming under her breath, completely unaware of the open safe. Meanwhile, Jasmine's eyes landed on the stacks of bills. She paused, staring in quiet wonder at the sight. To her, it must have looked like a mountain of treasure. She tiptoed closer, her little gloved hands twitching at her sides. Thomas, pretending to snore softly, prepared himself for the familiar sting of disappointment. Surely even a child wouldn't resist at least touching it. But what Jasmine did next caught him completely off guard. Instead of grabbing the bills or even brushing her fingers across them, Jasmine frowned. She noticed how messy and uneven the piles were. Slowly and carefully, she began to straighten the stacks. One by one, she separated the bills by size, lining them up neatly as though she were sorting coins at home. Her movements were precise, almost delicate, as if she understood the value of what she was handling, not in terms of wealth, but in respect. "Mommy," Jasmine whispered softly, "Mr. Thomas's money was all messy. I fixed it. Just like you showed me with our coins at home." Diana spun around, startled. Her heart nearly stopped when she saw her daughter standing beside the open safe. "Jasmine," she gasped. "You mustn't touch the boss's things." "But it was messy, Mom," Jasmine said with a gentle shrug. "He'll be glad when he wakes up and sees it's all tidy." Thomas felt something stir inside him that he hadn't felt in years. His throat tightened, his chest heavy with emotion. Here was a child, barely 6 years old, who had nothing, who likely had never held more than a $20 bill in her life. And faced with a fortune, she hadn't stolen a single dollar. She had only organized it with the innocent sincerity of someone who had nothing to hide. What Thomas didn't know was that this small, seemingly insignificant moment would spark a chain of events that would change not only his life, but Diana's and Jasmine's as well. It would reveal truths about honesty, prejudice, kindness, and the real worth of people. Truths he had long forgotten. If you're wondering how a 6-year-old girl could teach life lessons to a millionaire, be sure to subscribe to this channel and stay with us. Because this story is only beginning, and what follows will prove that the greatest lessons in life often come from the most unexpected places. Over the following weeks, Thomas continued observing Diana and her daughter quietly. His curiosity grew into something more: admiration. He discovered that Diana worked back-to-back jobs just to make ends meet. After her late-night cleaning shift at his company, she would head to a local doctor's office to clean again in the morning. Jasmine accompanied her everywhere, sometimes doing homework in waiting rooms, sometimes playing quietly in a corner while her mother scrubbed and polished. What struck Thomas the most wasn't just Diana's tireless effort, but the way she raised her daughter. He overheard her teaching Jasmine small but powerful lessons. "We always return what isn't ours even if no one is watching," she said one night. "Our honesty is worth more than money." Those words stayed with Thomas. They echoed in his mind long after Diana and Jasmine had gone home. Diana herself had not had an easy life. She had grown up in foster care after losing her parents at 9 years old. She worked her way through high school, but college was never affordable. At 22, she had given birth to Jasmine, and the father vanished the moment he learned about the pregnancy. From that day on, Diana had carried the weight alone, refusing government assistance she considered charity, determined to raise her daughter with dignity. Thomas, moved by her strength, quietly instructed the payroll department to increase her salary. He asked them to file it under category adjustment, so Diana wouldn't suspect favoritism. He wanted to help her without undermining her pride. But not everyone saw it that way. Richard Blackwood, the company's vice president and son of one of the founders, noticed the change during a finance meeting. A man spoiled by wealth and accustomed to power, Richard carried the kind of arrogance that comes from privilege unearned. "Thomas," Richard scoffed during the meeting, "why are we wasting extra money on cleaning staff? Especially that particular one?" "Diana is excellent at her work," Thomas replied evenly, his jaw tight. Richard chuckled bitterly. "You need to understand where these people belong. Give them an extra coin and soon they'll expect the whole vault. It's in their nature." The words cut through the room like poison. Thomas felt a wave of anger but forced himself to stay composed. Richard's prejudice had always been tolerated because of his family's influence, but this time, something in Thomas snapped. He didn't say it out loud, but he made a decision then and there. Richard had crossed a line. Later that week, Thomas saw Richard confront Diana in the hallway late at night. His voice was sharp, his tone dripping with contempt. "I know you're getting more money than you deserve," Richard hissed. "I don't know what kind of favors you're pulling, but it ends now. And get that child out of here. This isn't a daycare." Jasmine shrank behind her mother, her little eyes wide with fear. Diana held her close, standing her ground. "Sir, I only do my job. Nothing more." "Your job is to clean and stay invisible," Richard sneered. "Nothing else." From his office above, Thomas watched every second, his fists tightening. For the first time in years, he felt something he had almost forgotten, a pure, righteous anger. And deep inside, he knew he couldn't stay silent any longer. What Richard didn't realize was that Thomas had recorded the entire exchange on the very security system Richard himself had once approved. But Thomas wasn't satisfied with just a recording. He wanted justice, and he was willing to go further than Richard could ever imagine. And so began a plan that would not only protect Diana and Jasmine, but also expose Richard for who he truly was. This was no longer just a test of honesty. It was the beginning of a battle, one that would pit arrogance against integrity, prejudice against dignity, and reveal the true cost of underestimating the strength of an honest woman and her daughter. Thomas Mitchell's world had changed the night he witnessed Jasmine's act of pure honesty. For the first time in years, he felt that there was still goodness in people, still light in the world. But while that moment gave him hope, it also sharpened his awareness of the darkness that existed inside his own company. And no one embodied that darkness more than Richard Blackwood. Richard was 50 years old, the spoiled son of one of the company's founders. He had inherited not just shares in the business but also a sense of entitlement that made him believe others were beneath him. He was the kind of man who had never truly worked for anything yet thought of himself as superior to everyone around him. And when he noticed Diana's quiet raise, his arrogance turned into bitterness. Why her? Richard had asked Thomas in a boardroom full of executives. Why are we rewarding a cleaning lady? Because she's excellent at what she does, Thomas answered plainly, his voice clipped. Richard smirked, his tone dripping with prejudice. Thomas, don't fool yourself. People like her don't stay loyal. You hand them a little extra money, and they'll start demanding the whole safe. That's how they are. The room had gone silent, but no one spoke against him. Everyone knew Richard's influence and his family's standing in the company. Thomas clenched his fists under the table, his anger boiling. It wasn't just the insult to Diana, it was the way Richard had spoken about people like her, as if honesty and dignity didn't belong to her or anyone from her background. That night, as Diana and Jasmine went about their usual cleaning shift, Thomas noticed Richard lurking around. He stayed late in the office, his eyes following Diana with a cruel edge. When she finally walked past him in the hallway, Richard stopped her. "Listen carefully," he said coldly. "I don't know what you're doing to get that extra money, but it ends now. You don't belong here, and neither does that child of yours. This isn't a playground or a daycare. Do your job and keep your head down." Jasmine, clutching her school notebook, froze. Her small frame trembled as she pressed herself against her mother's side. Diana bent down and whispered, "It's okay, baby." Then she straightened, her chin high, her voice calm but firm. "Sir, I am only doing my job." Richard leaned closer, his tone mocking. "Your job is to clean and stay invisible. Nothing more." What Richard didn't know was that Thomas had seen everything from his office above. And what he didn't realize was that his own words were being recorded, every insult, every threat, every act of harassment. That night, as Thomas sat alone replaying the footage, he felt a wave of righteous fury. For too long, Richard had thrown his weight around unchecked. For too long, his prejudice had been ignored because of his family's shares in the business. But now Thomas had a reason to act. "This ends here," he whispered to himself. The very next morning, Thomas picked up his phone and made a call to a man he hadn't spoken to in years. "Marcus, I need your services again," he said into the receiver. On the other end, Marcus Chun chuckled knowingly. A former FBI investigator turned private consultant, Marcus had helped Thomas uncover the partner who stole millions from him years earlier. "What kind of mess this time, Thomas?" "The kind that involves racism and abuse of power," Thomas said grimly. "I need solid evidence against Richard Blackwood. Everything you can find." Marcus's laugh carried through the line. "That rich daddy's boy? Easy. Guys like him always leave a trail. Send me what you've got so far and I'll dig deeper." Meanwhile, Richard wasn't slowing down. In fact, he was only getting bolder. On Monday morning, he walked straight into the Human Resources Department with a folder full of papers. Sandra Miller, the HR director, looked up as he tossed it on her desk. "This employee," he began, "has been arriving late consistently. And she brings her child into the office, causing disruptions. It's unprofessional and unacceptable." Sandra frowned. She had been with the company for over a decade, and in all that time Diana Jefferson had never once been late. "Mr. Blackwood, I'll need to check the records before." Richard cut her off with arrogance. "I'm the vice president. My word should be enough. If you know what's good for you, you'll take action quickly." Sandra swallowed her frustration. She knew something was off, but Richard's influence made her cautious. Still, she made a mental note. Diana's record had always been spotless. Upstairs, Thomas sat in his office, watching everything unfold through the building's surveillance system. Richard had installed these cameras to monitor employees, but now, ironically, they were recording his own lies and intimidation. By Wednesday, Richard had escalated further. He intercepted Diana in the parking lot just as she and Jasmine were about to enter for the night shift. Blocking her path, he sneered, "I know you're not earning that extra pay just by cleaning. What exactly are you offering? What's your price?" Diana froze, shock and anger washing over her. "Sir, what you're suggesting is vile," she said firmly. Jasmine clutched her mother's leg, whispering, "Mommy, why is that man being mean?" Diana bent down and stroked her daughter's cheek. "Don't worry, sweetheart. Some people are unhappy inside, so they try to hurt others. But we won't let that change us." Richard laughed cruelly. "Unhappy? I've got more money in my wallet than you two will ever see in your lives. Don't get too comfortable here. People like you should know their place." What he didn't realize was that Thomas was watching the security footage that very night, his anger simmering. When Marcus arrived later with a preliminary report, the pieces began falling into place. "Look at this," Marcus said, tossing a folder onto Thomas's desk. Inside were documents, complaints, and legal filings. 3 lawsuits in his past. Same pattern every time. Harassment of Black or Latino employees, systematic humiliation until they quit. His father always paid to shut it down. He's a predator, Thomas. And he thinks he's untouchable. Thomas leaned back, his jaw tight, his mind racing. "Not anymore," he said quietly. "Then tell me," Marcus asked, raising an eyebrow, "how far do you want to take this?" "As far as it needs to go," Thomas replied. "I don't just want him stopped, I want him exposed. The first phase of the plan was already in motion. The recordings, the documents, the testimonies, all were being compiled. But Thomas knew this wouldn't just be about evidence. It would be about strategy. Richard had power, connections, and arrogance. And the only way to bring him down was to use those very things against him. From that night forward, every word Richard spoke, every step he took, was another nail in the coffin he was unknowingly building for himself. And Thomas, fueled by a sense of justice he hadn't felt in years, was determined to see it through. This was no longer about just protecting Diana and her daughter. It was about standing up to prejudice in the heart of his company. And Thomas was ready for the fight. The following days tested Thomas's patience as much as his resolve. Richard Blackwood, drunk on his own authority, grew bolder by the hour. Every time Thomas checked the surveillance recordings, there was more arrogance, more venom, more attempts to intimidate Diana and her little girl. By Thursday morning, Thomas knew this wasn't something he could fight halfway. Richard had to be stopped completely. Quietly. Permanently. That morning, Sandra Miller from Human Resources knocked on Thomas's office door. She stepped inside carefully, her eyes troubled. "Mr. Mitchell," she began, "I need to talk to you about Richard Blackwood." Thomas folded his hands, his expression calm but alert. "Go on." Sandra hesitated. She was a competent woman in her 40s, not easily rattled, but something about Richard's behavior had unsettled her. "He's pushing very hard for me to fire Diana Jefferson," she explained. "But I can't find a single reason on record. She has been one of our most punctual, reliable employees. Yet Mr. Blackwood insists she's violating regulations. Yesterday he even suggested that people like her shouldn't have access to the building after hours." Thomas felt his blood heat. "People like her," he repeated, his tone flat but sharp. Sandra nodded slowly. "Yes, sir. I didn't want to assume, but I believe his comments have discriminatory implications. Honestly, I think he's targeting her unfairly." Thomas leaned forward. "If you suspect discrimination, Sandra, document everything. I want a formal record. Every word he says, every attempt he makes to pressure you, write it all down." She blinked, surprised. "But he's the vice president. What if the board—" "I'm the president," Thomas interrupted firmly. "Do your job. Document everything." Sandra nodded, relieved to have his backing. When she left, Thomas exhaled slowly. This was the opening he needed. Richard wasn't just being cruel, he was laying the groundwork for his own downfall. That night, Thomas began phase 2 of his plan. He called in his IT team under the pretense of improving the security system. What they didn't know was that he had instructed them to install additional hidden microphones and cameras in areas where Richard often lurked. The hallways, the parking lot, even the executive floor. Officially, it was a safety upgrade. In reality, it was a trap. And sure enough, Richard walked right into it. Late Friday night, Thomas sat in his office, headphones on, listening to the live feed. Richard's voice crackled through the speakers. "Dad, that situation we discussed? Yeah, it's about the black cleaning lady. She's becoming a problem. I need you to use your contacts. Make life hard for her. Plant suspicions of theft, find issues with her documentation, whatever it takes to push her out. If we let these people feel too comfortable, they'll start thinking they deserve more. Better to handle it now before others like her get ideas." Thomas froze, his jaw tightening as he listened. It wasn't just workplace harassment anymore. This was a conspiracy. An open admission of prejudice. Richard wasn't acting alone. He was enlisting his father to create false charges against Diana. The next morning, Thomas met with Marcus, handing him the new recordings. Marcus listened, his eyebrows raised in disbelief. Well. He just confessed to conspiring to fabricate evidence. And on top of that, he laid bare his racism. Thomas nodded grimly. "We're going to use his arrogance against him. The deeper he digs this hole, the harder he'll fall." Marcus smirked. "Then we let him keep digging. I'll keep pulling everything I can, emails, private accounts, calls, the works. Guys like him always slip." Over the weekend, Marcus returned with a folder thick with evidence. He dropped it onto Thomas's desk with a heavy thud. "You're going to love this. Your vice president has a history, a long one." Thomas flipped through the documents, his eyes narrowing. 3 previous lawsuits? All for harassment of Black or Latino employees, Marcus confirmed. None ever saw a courtroom. Daddy paid them off, then shipped little Richard to another company. He's been doing this for years, Thomas. He's a serial predator. Thomas shook his head, disgust rising in his chest. Not anymore. Not on my watch. Meanwhile, Richard continued to tighten his noose. By Monday he had returned to HR again, this time with even more fabricated complaints. This woman is a liability, he declared to Sandra, slamming his hand on her desk. She brings her child here, disrupts the office and creates risks. If you don't act, I'll bring it up with the board myself. Sandra stayed calm but inwardly furious. Mr. Blackwood, I cannot dismiss an employee without evidence. Diana has been exemplary in her work. I'll need to investigate further. Richard sneered. Evidence? I told you what's happening. My word should be more than enough. Unbeknownst to him, Thomas was recording every word from his office upstairs. The arrogance, the lies, the threats, they were all captured in crystal clear audio and video. On Wednesday, Richard escalated again. He intercepted Diana in the parking lot as she and Jasmine arrived for their shift. His voice was low, venomous. You think you're clever, don't you? I know you're doing something more than cleaning to get that extra pay. Everyone has a price. What's yours? Diana stiffened, her face pale but her voice steady. Sir, what you're implying is shameful. I work. That's all I do. Richard smirked cruelly. Don't play innocent. Women like you always find another way to earn. I'll figure it out, and when I do, you'll regret it. Jasmine clung to her mother, her frightened whisper carrying through the microphone. Mommy, why is he being so mean? Thomas's heart twisted as he listened. That was it. Enough was enough. Richard had just crossed another line, and this one couldn't be erased. That night, Thomas called Marcus again. It's time, he said simply. Marcus leaned back in his chair, a grin spreading across his face. So what's the play? Thomas looked out his window at the city skyline, his voice calm but resolute. Justice. But not just justice. I want him exposed so thoroughly, so completely, that he'll never show his face in this industry again. Marcus nodded. Then we'll let him bury himself. And when he does, we'll make sure the whole world is watching. For the first time in years, Thomas felt alive. He wasn't just protecting Diana and Jasmine anymore. He was preparing to take down a man who had built his life on cruelty and prejudice. And he was going to do it in a way Richard Blackwood would never see coming. By Thursday morning, Richard Blackwood was convinced he was untouchable. What he didn't realize was that every word he spoke, every insult he spat, every scheme he whispered into the phone was being documented in real time. The very tools he had once demanded, security cameras, microphones, monitoring systems, were now recording his downfall. That afternoon, Sandra Miller, the head of human resources, knocked on Thomas Mitchell's door again. She stepped inside, her expression troubled. Mr. Mitchell, she began cautiously, I've been documenting Richard's conduct like you asked. It's getting worse. Thomas motioned for her to sit. Tell me everything. Sandra opened a folder. Inside were notes, emails, and summaries of Richard's attempts to interfere with Diana Jefferson's employment. He's been pressing hard, she explained. Fabricated violations, false accusations of lateness, claims that her daughter is disruptive. None of it checks out. I've double-checked the logs. Diana hasn't been late once in 2 years. Thomas listened carefully, his jaw tightening. Sandra hesitated, then leaned forward. Sir, I've also overheard him making comments about people like her. Thomas's eyes darkened. You've documented that? Sandra nodded. Yes. I've kept everything on file. But I'll be honest, sir, I'm concerned. Richard has influence on the board. If I go too far, it could backfire. Thomas folded his hands on the desk. His voice was calm but resolute. Sandra, you've done the right thing. Keep documenting. Leave the rest to me. Sandra left with a quiet nod, relieved but still uneasy. That evening, as Diana and Jasmine arrived for their shift, Thomas sat upstairs watching the monitors. Richard's behavior had become predictable. He circled like a vulture, waiting for opportunities to corner Diana. Sure enough, within 20 minutes, Richard appeared in the corridor. His face was smug, his tone dripping with condescension. Still here? He asked Diana as she wiped down the reception desk. Still dragging your child into places she doesn't belong? Diana straightened, her shoulders squared. Sir, my daughter is quiet. She studies while I work. She isn't bothering anyone. Richard laughed bitterly. Not yet. But people like you always find a way to cause trouble. I don't know what favors you're trading for that extra money, but it won't last. Thomas's fists clenched as he listened through the hidden microphones. The cruelty, the arrogance, it wasn't just unprofessional. It was inhuman. And then Richard made his boldest move yet. On Friday night he stayed late in the office, alone. Thinking no one could hear him, he dialed his father's number on speakerphone. The words that followed were all Thomas needed. "Dad, it's that cleaning lady again," Richard said coldly. "She's becoming a real problem. I want her gone. Use your contacts. Create some legal mess. Immigration issues, theft suspicion, whatever it takes. I don't care how you do it. Just make her disappear. People like her don't belong here." Thomas sat in silence, the audio feed piping every poisonous word into his office. His chest burned with a mix of fury and resolve. Richard had just handed him the final piece of the puzzle, a recorded conspiracy planned in his own words. When Marcus arrived later that night, Thomas wasted no time. He played the recording. Marcus whistled low. He's not just harassing her anymore. He's conspiring with his father to commit fraud and discrimination. This is enough to bury him. Thomas shook his head. Not yet. I don't just want him buried. I want him exposed. Publicly. So there's no coming back. Marcus grinned. Then we let him hang himself even more. I'll keep digging. Meanwhile you prepare your stage. And dig Marcus did. By Monday morning he returned with a thick folder of evidence. Look at this, he said, spreading photos and documents across the desk. Private social media accounts. Supremacist comments. Closed group chats with other executives. Racist jokes, slurs, the works. He's been doing this for years. Thomas scanned the pages, his anger deepening with every screenshot. Posts calling black employees monkeys. Comments about keeping minorities in their place. Discussions about sabotaging job candidates from diverse backgrounds. He's a serial predator, Marcus said firmly. A professional bully. He doesn't just discriminate, he plans it. He weaponizes his position. Thomas leaned back in his chair, staring at the city skyline. Then we give him the stage he craves. He thinks he's untouchable. Let's prove him wrong. That same week, Richard made his most dangerous plan yet. Marcus intercepted messages between Richard and one of his shady contacts. The scheme was clear. Richard intended to plant an expensive watch in Diana's cleaning cart and discover it later, framing her for theft. Marcus slammed the file shut. He's going to set her up, Thomas? Plant evidence, call security, humiliate her in front of everyone. Thomas's face hardened. Perfect, he said quietly. Marcus blinked. Perfect. Thomas nodded slowly. If he wants to stage a performance, we'll make sure it's recorded from every angle. When he tries to frame Diana, he'll be framing himself instead. And this time the world will be watching. That night, Thomas ordered his IT team to activate additional high-definition cameras in the building. He quietly contacted 3 investigative journalists, inviting them to be on standby. Marcus arranged a mobile surveillance van in the parking lot, ready to capture every moment. Richard thought he was preparing the perfect trap for Diana. But in truth every step he took was. By Tuesday evening, Richard Blackwood was certain he had crafted the perfect plan. In his mind, everything was in place. He had purchased a brand new Rolex watch that very morning, one worth nearly $15,000, and hidden it in the inner pocket of his jacket. His plan was simple. Wait until Diana Jefferson arrived for her night shift, slip the watch into her cleaning cart, and then discover it with great theatrical outrage. For Richard it was foolproof. After all, who would believe a maid's word over that of the company's vice president? He had the authority, the reputation, and the arrogance to think no one could ever challenge him. What he didn't know was that Thomas Mitchell had already anticipated every move. That evening, Diana arrived with Jasmine, who clutched her notebook and crayons as always. The little girl settled at a desk to quietly draw while her mother gathered cleaning supplies. To her, it was just another night with her mom at work. She had no idea that she was walking into the middle of a trap. But upstairs, Thomas was watching on a wall of high-definition monitors. He had cameras covering every angle of the building now. In the parking lot, Marcus sat inside a surveillance van filled with equipment, headphones over his ears, eyes on live feeds. 3 investigative journalists, handpicked by Thomas, waited discreetly outside, ready to be called in at the right moment. At exactly 7:50 p.m., Richard entered the executive floor. He looked around carefully, but what he didn't realize was that every one of his movements was being tracked by hidden cameras. With a smug smirk, he bent down and placed the Rolex watch inside Diana's cleaning cart, tucking it beneath a stack of supplies. He whispered to himself, "Perfect." On the monitors upstairs, Thomas leaned forward. "Marcus, he just planted it." "Copy that," Marcus replied. "We've got him on 3 separate angles." "Good," Thomas said calmly. "Let him continue." 15 minutes later, Richard stormed down the hallway with 2 security guards at his side. He approached Diana with fake urgency. "Mrs. Jefferson," he said, his voice filled with false courtesy, "we've had reports of missing items. I'll need to inspect your cleaning supplies." Diana blinked, confused. "Missing items? Sir, I don't understand." "It's standard procedure," Richard lied smoothly. Without waiting for permission, he dug through the cart, theatrically rifling through rags and bottles of disinfectant. Then, with a gasp that could have won him an acting award, he pulled out the watch. Well, what do we have here?" "A Rolex watch worth $15,000 missing since yesterday." Diana's face drained of color. I've never seen that in my life." "Of course not," Richard sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "It just magically appeared in your cart, right?" Jasmine stood up from her chair, her little eyes wide with fear. "Mommy, what's going on?" "Be quiet, child," Richard snapped cruelly. "Your mother has some explaining to do." One of the security guards picked up the phone. "We need the police," he began. "We have a theft in progress." And that was when Thomas Mitchell finally made his move. The office door swung open, and Thomas stepped inside with Marcus at his side. Behind them entered 3 people Richard didn't recognize at first, until one of them raised a camera. Richard froze, his face paling. "Thomas? What are you doing here?" Thomas's expression was calm, almost too calm. "I think you should hang up that phone," he said evenly. Richard tried to recover his composure. "Good timing. We caught your employee red-handed stealing from you." Thomas let out a cold laugh. "My watch." "Richard, I've been wearing an Apple Watch for 5 years. I've never owned a Rolex." Richard's confident smirk faltered. "What are you talking about?" Thomas stepped closer, his voice like steel. "I'm talking about the fact that we have you on camera planting that watch in Diana's cart 40 minutes ago." "Marcus." Marcus pulled out a tablet and swiped the screen. Instantly, high-definition footage played. Richard bending over the cart, slipping the Rolex beneath the cleaning supplies. He played it again from another angle. And then another. Richard's face went pale, sweat forming on his forehead. "That's not." Thomas cut him off. "Oh, but there's more." "Marcus, show him the rest." The tablet screen lit up with screenshots of Richard's private social media posts. "Need to keep these monkeys in their place," Marcus read aloud. "Sound familiar, Richard?" Diana gasped softly, covering her mouth with her hands. Jasmine clung to her mother's leg, frightened but silent. "And here," Marcus continued, "is your phone call to your father just 2 nights ago. Your words exactly: make life hard for her. Plant suspicions of theft. Push her out before others like her get ideas. Care to deny it?" Richard's breathing grew shallow. "Where did you get this?" he stammered. "The security system," Thomas replied coldly. "The one you yourself insisted we install." At that moment, one of the journalists stepped forward. Jennifer Walsh, Channel 7 News. "Mr. Blackwood, would you like to comment on this evidence of racial discrimination and conspiracy to frame an innocent employee?" Richard's eyes darted wildly. "You can't use that. I have rights." "Of course you do," Thomas said calmly. "You have the right to remain silent. Because anything you say from this moment on will be used against you, not just by the police who are already on their way, but also by the press, the company board, and Diana's lawyers." Another journalist raised his microphone. "Mr. Blackwood, how long have you been targeting minority employees? Our sources suggest this isn't the first time." Richard tried to run, but Marcus stepped into his path, blocking the exit. Now, Marcus said smoothly. "We're not finished yet." Thomas turned back to Diana, who still stood frozen, pale and shaken. "Diana, you've done nothing wrong. And tonight, everyone will see the truth." Jasmine tugged at Thomas's sleeve. "Mr. Thomas, Will the bad man stop scaring Mommy now? Thomas knelt so his eyes met hers. Yes, sweetheart. He'll never scare her again. At that very moment, flashing red and blue lights filled the windows. The police burst through the door, led by Detective Harris. Richard Blackwood, the officer announced, you are under arrest for conspiracy to fabricate evidence, harassment, racial discrimination, and attempted defamation. The security guards who had followed Richard earlier exchanged nervous glances. One slowly lowered the phone, ashamed. As the officers handcuffed Richard, he twisted his head to glare at Thomas. You'll regret this. My family has influence. My father. Thomas cut him off, his voice steady. Your father already called this morning asking to have the Blackwood family name removed from all company records. He wants nothing more to do with you. One of the journalists spoke again, her camera flashing. Mr. Blackwood, how does it feel to know your own family has abandoned you? Richard said nothing. For the first time in his life he looked small, cornered, powerless. Diana's knees nearly gave out as relief washed over her. She hugged Jasmine tightly, whispering, It's over, baby. It's really over. Thomas placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. No, Diana. This is just the beginning. Because tonight was not just about catching Richard. It was about dismantling everything he had built on cruelty and prejudice, and replacing it with something better. And as Richard was led out in handcuffs, cameras flashing, Thomas knew the world had just witnessed the first act of a downfall so complete it would be remembered for years to come. The news of Richard Blackwood's arrest spread faster than wildfire. By the time he was escorted out of the Mitchell Enterprises building in handcuffs, the flashing cameras and shouting reporters had already turned the scandal into breaking news. Within hours, his face was plastered across television screens, news websites, and social media feeds. Vice President of major corporation arrested on charges of racial discrimination and conspiracy, the headlines read. Clips of him planting the Rolex watch and berating Diana ran in endless loops, paired with his recorded comments about people like her. For the first time in his life, Richard's name was not a shield, it was a curse. Inside the building, Diana sat trembling in Thomas's office with Jasmine on her lap. Her hands shook as she tried to process what had just happened. Mr. Mitchell, did you know this was going to happen? She asked in disbelief. Thomas's gaze softened. Diana, I knew Richard had crossed lines. I knew he was dangerous. But when I saw how far he was willing to go to destroy you, I couldn't stay silent anymore. Diana blinked back tears. You risked everything for me and my daughter. No, Thomas said firmly. I didn't risk anything. I invested in what mattered, justice. At his side, Marcus smirked, arms folded across his chest. And besides, he added, guys like Richard always think they're untouchable. They leave trails everywhere. All we had to do was shine a light on them. Meanwhile, outside the building, reporters swarmed. One journalist cornered a board member as he left the parking garage. Do you have any comment on the allegations against Vice President Richard Blackwood? The board member shook his head grimly. The company does not tolerate discrimination in any form. A special meeting has already been scheduled to address Mr. Blackwood's removal. The next morning that meeting was held. Every executive, shareholder, and board member gathered around the long mahogany table. Thomas presided at the head, his presence commanding but calm. At the other end, Richard's chair sat empty. Ladies and gentlemen, Thomas began, his voice steady, you've all seen the evidence. Recordings. Video footage. Social media posts. Attempts to fabricate theft against an innocent employee. Racial discrimination documented over 15 years. This is not speculation, it is fact. The room was silent, heavy with shame. One board member finally spoke. Thomas, with all due respect, the Blackwood family has been tied to this company since its founding. Are you certain you want to sever that link? Thomas looked him dead in the eye. This company was built on hard work and integrity, not on arrogance and prejudice. If keeping the Blackwood name means tolerating what Richard has done, then yes, I want it severed. There were murmurs around the table, but no one argued. The evidence was too overwhelming. The vote was unanimous. Richard Blackwood was terminated for cause, his family shares forcibly bought out by the company. His influence, his power, his legacy, it was all gone in one stroke. That afternoon, as Diana quietly cleaned up her supplies, Thomas approached her. Diana, he said gently, You no longer need to be afraid. Richard won't ever harm you again. Her eyes filled with tears. I don't even know how to thank you. By continuing to be who you are, Thomas said warmly. The world needs people like you and Jasmine more than it needs people like Richard. Meanwhile, Richard himself sat in a holding cell, his expensive suit wrinkled, his hands cuffed, his face pale with fear. For the first time in his life, no one rushed to protect him. His father, furious at the disgrace, refused to post bail. His lawyer told him bluntly, "The evidence against you is overwhelming. Your career is finished." When the trial began a few weeks later, the courtroom was packed. Every news outlet covered it, every detail dissected. The recordings of Richard's own words were played aloud, "Plant suspicions of theft. People like her don't belong here." Gasps echoed through the courtroom as the jury listened. Diana sat quietly with Jasmine at her side, holding her little girl's hand tightly. She didn't want to be there, but she knew this was bigger than her. This was about every person Richard had ever bullied, humiliated, or pushed aside. And when the verdict came, guilty on multiple counts of conspiracy, harassment, and discrimination, the room erupted. Richard's shoulders slumped as the judge sentenced him to prison. For a man who had once strutted through corporate halls like a king, the humiliation was crushing. Back at Mitchell Enterprises, however, the atmosphere was different. The weight that had hung over the company for years seemed to lift. Employees who had once walked in silence now greeted one another with smiles. Diana, who had once been invisible, became a quiet symbol of dignity and resilience. And Thomas, for the first time in years, felt proud, not of his wealth, not of his title, but of what his company was becoming. That evening, as he walked Diana and Jasmine out to their car, Jasmine tugged at his hand. "Mr. Thomas," she said shyly, "are you like a superhero?" Thomas chuckled softly, kneeling so he was eye level with her. "No, Jasmine. The real superheroes are people like your mom, who stay honest and strong no matter what." Jasmine smiled, hugging her mother tightly. What none of them knew was that this was only the beginning of something much bigger. Because Thomas wasn't content to stop at exposing Richard. He wanted to use this moment to build something lasting, something that would change lives for years to come. And so, in the weeks that followed, Mitchell Enterprises began a transformation that would make headlines across the country. Richard Blackwood's trial ended with a verdict that stunned the corporate world. For years, he had operated under a veil of privilege, always certain that money and connections would protect him. But this time, his arrogance had finally caught up with him. The sentence was clear: 18 months in prison for conspiracy, attempted defamation, and racial harassment. The courtroom buzzed with shock when the gavel struck. Richard's face, once smug and confident, was pale with disbelief. He looked around the room for support, his father, his colleagues, his allies, but no one met his eyes. The same people who once bowed to him now turned away in silence. As officers led him out in handcuffs, reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, and headlines were written in real time. Millionaire's vice president sentenced to prison over racial discrimination case. The name Richard Blackwood, once associated with power, was now a stain on every headline. For Thomas Mitchell, watching the coverage from his office, the feeling was bittersweet. Justice had been served, but he knew this wasn't only about punishing Richard. It was about what came next, about building something new in place of what Richard had tried to destroy. Meanwhile, Diana Jefferson returned to her life with quiet dignity. Though she no longer had to fear Richard lurking in the hallways, she still worked her shifts, still raised her daughter with the same values she had always held. But there was something different now. People noticed her. Employees greeted her with respect instead of indifference. Colleagues who once looked past her now offered warm smiles. One evening, as she was finishing her shift, Thomas stopped her in the hallway. "Diana," he said, his tone thoughtful, "I've been thinking. You've shown remarkable strength, not just in your work, but in the way you've raised Jasmine. I don't want you cleaning floors for the rest of your life." Diana blinked, startled. "Sir?" Thomas smiled gently. "I've reviewed your records. You once started a business degree, didn't you?" Her eyes widened. "Yes, but I couldn't finish. After my parents passed, money was always tight. Then when Jasmine was born, it became impossible." Thomas nodded. "Then let's change that. I want to create a position for you, Director of Human Resources. You've shown more integrity and wisdom than most executives I've met. And I want you to finish that degree." I'll cover the costs. Diana's hand flew to her mouth, tears brimming in her eyes. Mr. Mitchell. I don't know what to say. Say yes, Thomas replied simply. At that moment, Jasmine skipped up with her notebook, smiling. Mommy, did Mr. Thomas give you homework too? The three of them laughed together, the tension of the past weeks finally easing. As Diana stepped into her new role, Mitchell Enterprises began to change. Under her guidance, a scholarship program was created for employees' children, so no child would be left behind the way she once had been. Jasmine was the very first recipient, her tuition at a top private school fully covered. News outlets quickly picked up the story. From maid to director, how integrity transformed a mother's life. Employees shared the story proudly, posting photos of Diana and Jasmine online. Mitchell Enterprises became a symbol of what corporate responsibility could look like when guided by values instead of prejudice. Meanwhile, life in prison was not kind to Richard Blackwood. For the first time, he wasn't surrounded by subordinates or shielded by wealth. He was just another inmate stripped of title and privilege. His arrogance quickly made him a target. The man who once looked down on others now found himself at the bottom of the hierarchy. Back in the outside world, his downfall was complete. His wife filed for divorce, taking half of their remaining assets. His children changed their last name, unwilling to be associated with him. Old colleagues blocked his calls. And when he was finally released 18 months later, he discovered that no reputable company would hire him. The contrast couldn't have been sharper. While Richard's life spiraled into ruin, Diana and Jasmine's lives blossomed. Jasmine thrived at her new school, making friends and excelling in her classes. She spoke with excitement about wanting to be a lawyer one day, so she could help people like Mr. Thomas helped us. Thomas often found himself smiling when he heard her say things like that. The honesty of a 6-year-old had not only restored his faith in humanity, it had ignited a transformation in his company and in his own heart. One evening, during a small company dinner, Jasmine ran up to Thomas holding a drawing she had made. Mr. Thomas, look. I drew our family. The picture showed herself, her mother, and Thomas all holding hands under a bright sun. Thomas felt his throat tighten as he looked at the drawing. Family. It was something he hadn't felt in years. Diana, embarrassed, tried to apologize. Jasmine, don't bother Mr. Mitchell. But Thomas shook his head. She's not bothering me. In fact, I think she just reminded me what this company should always stand for. From that moment, Thomas resolved that Mitchell Enterprises would never again be a place where prejudice thrived. It would be a place where honesty, dignity, and fairness were celebrated. And while Richard sat alone, bitter and forgotten, Diana and Jasmine were stepping into a brighter future. One they had earned not by wealth or connections but by integrity. If you believe that true wealth comes not from money but from honesty and strength of character, then make sure you subscribe, because this story is only growing, and what happens next will inspire you even more. When Richard Blackwood walked out of prison 18 months later, he was not the same man who had strutted into the courtroom with arrogant confidence. His once tailored suits were replaced by cheap, ill-fitting clothes. His hair was thinner, his face older, his shoulders slumped from months of humiliation. The cameras that had once captured his rise in the corporate world now documented his fall. Reporters outside the prison gates snapped photos, but there were no microphones shoved in his face, no admiration in their voices. Only questions that cut like knives. Mr. Blackwood, how does it feel to lose everything? Do you have any comment on the racist remarks that went viral? Where will you work now that no company will take you back? Richard kept his head down, muttering no comment. But he knew the truth. His life, his career, his reputation were ruined beyond repair. Back in the city, Diana Jefferson was living a very different reality. 6 months after Richard's conviction, Thomas Mitchell had formally introduced her as the new director of human resources. The announcement made headlines: former cleaner now executive, a story of integrity and justice. On her very first day in her new office, Diana sat at a polished desk overlooking the city skyline. Jasmine twirled in the corner, proudly showing off her new school uniform. "Mommy, it looks like you're the boss now," she giggled. Diana smiled, her eyes misting. She remembered the long nights scrubbing floors, the endless hours balancing 2 jobs, the fear she had felt under Richard's shadow. And now here she was, not because of luck but because of the values she refused to compromise. Thomas had given her more than a job title. He had given her trust, authority, and the chance to make real changes. Her first official decision was the creation of a scholarship fund for employees' children. She called it the Fair Chance Program, and Jasmine was its first beneficiary. Soon, dozens of families were benefiting from the same opportunities Diana had once been denied. Meanwhile, Richard tried to rebuild what little he had left. But everywhere he turned, doors slammed shut. Former colleagues refused his calls. Companies, once eager to use his family name, now shunned him. At one interview, a hiring manager looked at his resume, then typed his name into a search engine. Within seconds, the screen filled with headlines: "Millionaire VP jailed for racial discrimination. Watch the video of Richard Blackwood planting evidence." The manager looked up, stone-faced. "I'm sorry, Mr. Blackwood. We can't hire you." He left that office with sweat on his brow, humiliated. His once pristine reputation had become digital poison. Every attempt to scrub his name from the internet failed. His racist posts, his courtroom recordings, his arrest, all of it resurfaced instantly. At home things weren't better. His wife had left him during his trial, filing for divorce and taking half of their remaining assets. His children had changed their last name, wanting nothing to do with their disgraced father. Richard, once surrounded by people who praised him, now lived alone in a cramped apartment on the edge of town. In contrast, Mitchell Enterprises thrived. Under Diana's leadership, employee morale skyrocketed. The company won awards for diversity and inclusion, becoming a national model. Journalists who had once covered Richard's crimes now flocked to write about Diana's success. From foster care to the boardroom, Diana Jefferson's journey inspires a nation. At a televised event, Thomas stood beside her as she announced the expansion of the scholarship fund. Cameras flashed, audiences applauded. Jasmine, sitting in the front row, beamed with pride. That night at dinner, Jasmine looked up from her plate. "Mr. Thomas, my teacher asked us to write about our heroes. Can I write about you?" Thomas's eyes welled with emotion. "Jasmine, the real hero is your mother. She's the one who taught you honesty and strength." Diana smiled, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. "No, Mr. Mitchell. The hero is the man who had the courage to fight when it would have been easier to ignore." At that very moment, Richard sat alone in his apartment, a cheap takeout meal on his lap, the television flickering. On the screen, the evening news aired a segment about Mitchell Enterprises' new diversity program. There was Diana, smiling confidently in her new role. There was Jasmine, laughing in her school uniform. And there was Thomas, explaining how one act of honesty from a 6-year-old had transformed an entire company. Richard's stomach churned as he watched. The very people he had tried to destroy were now symbols of justice and hope, while he had become nothing more than a cautionary tale. He turned off the TV in frustration, but the silence of his apartment only deepened the emptiness inside him. He reached for his phone, scrolling through contacts. Old business partners, board members, executives, but one by one the calls went unanswered. His messages remained unread. He was a ghost in the world he once ruled. And while Richard faded into irrelevance, Diana's influence only grew. She was invited to speak at conferences, to share her story with young women, especially those from underprivileged backgrounds. She spoke with humility, always crediting her daughter for being the spark that changed everything. "Honesty isn't about what you do when people are watching," she said during one keynote speech. "It's about what you do when no one expects it. My daughter taught me that even a child's actions can transform lives." The audience rose to their feet in thunderous applause. And Thomas, sitting quietly at the side of the stage, couldn't help but think back to that night when he pretended to be asleep. That one simple act of a little girl arranging money instead of stealing it had rippled outward, changing not just his company but lives across the nation. If you believe that even the smallest act of honesty can grow into something that changes the world, don't forget to subscribe, because the next part of this story proves that legacies are built not on wealth, but on character. 3 years passed after the scandal that shook Mitchell Enterprises. For most people, the memory of Richard Blackwood's downfall was already history, a story told in business schools as a warning of what happens when arrogance and prejudice go unchecked. But for those directly touched by the events, the transformation was ongoing and life-changing. Inside the company, the atmosphere had shifted completely. Employees once afraid to speak now thrived under a culture of fairness and opportunity. Thanks to Diana Jefferson's leadership as Director of Human Resources, Mitchell Enterprises launched new programs to recruit diverse talent, provide mentorship opportunities, and offer scholarships to employees' children. Within a short span, the company became a national model for inclusion. The Fair Chance program she had created already supported more than 200 families. Each semester, proud parents watched their children enter universities they once only dreamed of. Many of them stopped by Diana's office, shaking her hand with tears in their eyes, thanking her for giving their children the opportunity she had once been denied. At home, Diana's own life had changed in ways she never imagined. No longer burdened by endless double shifts, she now had time to finish her education. With Thomas's encouragement, she returned to school and earned her long-delayed business degree. Not only did she complete it, but she excelled, graduating at the top of her class. Soon after, she began pursuing her MBA, determined to use her position to inspire even greater change. Jasmine too was flourishing. At 10 years old, she attended one of the best private schools in the city. Her teachers often spoke of her brilliance, her empathy, and her determination to help others. When asked what she wanted to be when she grew up, her answer never wavered. "I want to be a lawyer," she would say proudly, "so I can fight for people who don't have a voice." Thomas often marveled at her confidence. Sometimes he wondered if Jasmine truly realized how much she had changed his own life. That little act of honesty, tidying stacks of money when she could have taken them, had not only restored his faith in humanity, but had ignited a wave of justice that touched hundreds of families. Meanwhile, Richard Blackwood lived a very different reality. After leaving prison, he struggled to find work. His once famous last name had become a scarlet letter. Even the smallest jobs slipped through his fingers. Potential employers would search his name, and immediately the headlines appeared: "Disgraced executive jailed for discrimination." Old video clips of him planting the Rolex watch or making racist remarks still circulated online. At one point, he tried to work as a consultant under a fake name, but within weeks someone recognized him. The clients pulled out, the deal collapsed, and he was forced to return to his dingy apartment. Eventually, he settled for working at a used car lot, earning less in a year than Diana now earned in 3 months. Customers who recognized him sometimes mocked him openly. Others refused to deal with him. His marriage was long gone. His ex-wife had moved on, remarried, and built a new life. His children refused contact, having legally changed their last names to distance themselves from his disgrace. Alone and bitter, Richard spent his nights scrolling online articles, seething as he watched Diana and Thomas celebrated in the press. It was almost poetic. The woman he had once sneered at as invisible, was now a nationally recognized leader, while he, the man who once believed himself untouchable, had been reduced to obscurity. Thomas, meanwhile, continued to grow Mitchell Enterprises with renewed purpose. The company won awards for ethical leadership, diversity, and innovation. At one gala, Thomas stood at the podium with Diana at his side, proudly sharing their story with the audience. "This company was saved not by wealth," he told the crowd, "but by a 6-year-old child who reminded us of the value of honesty." The audience erupted in applause, many moved to tears. Diana placed a hand over her heart, humbled by the recognition. Jasmine sat in the front row, her eyes shining with pride. Later that evening, as Thomas walked Diana and Jasmine out to their car, Jasmine tugged on his sleeve. "Mr. Thomas, can I ask you something?" "Of course," Thomas said warmly. "My teacher asked us to write about heroes again," Jasmine explained. "Last year I wrote about Mommy. This year I want to write about both of you. Is that okay?" Thomas chuckled softly, touched by her words. "Jasmine, you can write whatever you feel in your heart. But don't forget, you were the one who started all of this." Jasmine grinned, wrapping her arms around his waist. "Then maybe I'll write about me too." Diana laughed, shaking her head. "That's my girl." While Diana and Jasmine's lives continued to shine, Richard's shadow only deepened. He tried desperately to repair his reputation. He created new social media accounts under different names, but people always discovered who he was. His old posts, his trial footage, his humiliating downfall, they followed him like ghosts, impossible to erase. At one point, a journalist tracked him down for an interview. "Mr. Blackwood," she asked bluntly, "do you feel remorse for what you did?" Richard's jaw tightened. "I was set up," he muttered bitterly. "None of it was my fault. The journalist raised an eyebrow. The camera showed otherwise. The interview aired, and instead of rebuilding sympathy, it destroyed what little credibility he had left. Comments flooded online, "Still arrogant. No accountability. This man hasn't learned a thing." Richard turned off the television in disgust, but deep down he knew the truth. He had become a permanent example of what happens when power is abused. Meanwhile, Diana's reputation only soared. She was invited to Washington to speak about workplace reform. She appeared on national television, sharing her journey from cleaner to executive. And at every turn she credited her daughter. "It was Jasmine's honesty that changed everything," she told one interviewer. "She reminded us all that integrity is priceless." For Thomas, watching their journey was the greatest reward. He no longer measured success by profit margins or market share. Success to him was seeing Jasmine thrive, seeing Diana flourish, and knowing that his company had become a place of fairness and opportunity. Richard, bitter and forgotten, could only watch from the sidelines as the world celebrated the very people he once tried to destroy. His downfall was complete, his legacy reduced to a warning, while Diana and Jasmine's legacy had only just begun. By the fourth year after Richard Blackwood's disgrace, Mitchell Enterprises had become more than just a business. It had become a movement. What once was a traditional corporation now stood as a national symbol of change, progress, and integrity. Its story was told in classrooms, boardrooms, and community centers across the country. The turning point came when Thomas Mitchell and Diana Jefferson unveiled a new foundation, the Jasmine Trust. Named after the little girl whose honesty started it all, the trust focused on scholarships, mentorships, and community development programs. Its mission was clear: no child, regardless of background, should ever be denied opportunity because of poverty or prejudice. The launch event was broadcast live. On stage, Thomas introduced Diana as the Trust's co-founder and executive director. Cameras flashed as Diana spoke with quiet strength. "I started as a cleaner in this very building," she told the audience. "I worked long nights, often invisible, and thought my daughter and I would always remain in the shadows. But one act of honesty changed everything. This trust is here to make sure every child has a chance to step into the light." The crowd rose in a standing ovation. Jasmine, now 11, beamed with pride as she clutched her mother's hand. As the trust grew, so did its impact. Dozens of children received full scholarships. Families once burdened by financial struggles began to see brighter futures. Teachers wrote letters describing how students, once hopeless, now excelled in their studies thanks to the opportunities the trust provided. Each success story traced back to that one night when a little girl made a choice to do what was right. Meanwhile, Richard Blackwood's life had withered into obscurity. His apartment walls were stained, his phone rarely rang, and his name, once powerful, was now only whispered in derision. Occasionally, young interns at companies would stumble across his story in training seminars, where he was used as an example of arrogance and failure. Once, while walking down the street, he overheard two students pointing at him. "That's the guy, isn't it? The one who framed that maid." Richard ducked his head, shame burning his face. His attempts to rebuild had all collapsed. No business wanted his advice, no community welcomed his presence, and even casual acquaintances avoided him. The same arrogance that once gave him confidence now left him with nothing but regret. Thomas, however, never gloated in Richard's ruin. He rarely spoke of him at all. For Thomas, the true story wasn't Richard's downfall, it was Diana's rise and Jasmine's future. In the 5th year, Mitchell Enterprises celebrated its centennial anniversary. At the grand event, employees from every level filled the ballroom. On stage, Thomas stood beside Diana and Jasmine, smiling proudly as he addressed the crowd. "This company began 100 years ago with a vision of growth and prosperity," Thomas said. "But somewhere along the way we lost sight of what truly matters. Thanks to the courage of a child and the resilience of her mother, we were reminded that integrity is the foundation of success. Tonight we honor that reminder." Diana stepped forward, her voice steady. "This is not just about us. This is about every person who has ever been overlooked, every worker who has ever been underestimated. Tonight we say loudly and clearly, you matter. Your honesty, your dignity, your humanity matters." The applause was thunderous. Cameras captured the moment, and within hours, clips of the speech went viral online. People around the country shared the story again, reigniting the message that justice and fairness were worth fighting for. That night, as the celebration ended, Jasmine tugged at Thomas's sleeve once more. "Mr. Thomas," she said with a smile, "I know what I want to be now." Thomas bent down, smiling. "Oh, what's that?" "I want to be president," Jasmine said boldly. Diana laughed, shaking her head. "Dream big, baby girl." But Thomas didn't laugh. His eyes softened as he looked at her. "Why not, Jasmine? You've already changed more lives than most adults ever will." Jasmine grinned, her confidence unshaken. And in that moment, it became clear that the story wasn't ending, it was just beginning. Richard Blackwood, alone in his apartment, watched a snippet of the celebration on the evening news. He saw the smiling faces, the standing ovations, the glowing speeches. He saw Diana, once invisible, now a respected leader. He saw Jasmine, no longer a child in the background, but the symbol of hope for a brighter future. He turned off the television, sinking into the silence of his empty room. The world had moved on without him, and he knew it would never look back. Meanwhile, Mitchell Enterprises and the Jasmine Trust thrived, fueled by a single lesson that echoed through every corner of their work. True wealth is not measured by money but by character. 10 years had passed since the night Thomas Mitchell pretended to sleep and a 6-year-old child unknowingly rewrote the course of countless lives. What began as a quiet test of honesty had grown into a movement that touched schools, workplaces, and communities across the nation. Diana Jefferson was now one of the most respected executives in the country. Her work as Director of Human Resources had transformed Mitchell Enterprises into an award-winning model of fairness and opportunity. But her impact went far beyond the company. Through the Jasmine Trust, she had helped thousands of young people gain access to education, mentorship, and opportunities their parents could only dream of. Invitations to speak poured in, from universities, conferences, and even international summits. And yet, through it all, Diana remained the same grounded woman she had always been. She never forgot her roots, never let the spotlight change her, and never stopped reminding others that her daughter was the true spark of it all. Jasmine, now 16, was blossoming into a young woman of extraordinary confidence and vision. She excelled in school, leading debate clubs and volunteering with the trust. Teachers often described her as someone who carried herself with wisdom beyond her years. In her speeches, she spoke with the clarity of someone who had lived through injustice but refused to let it define her. One evening, she stood at a podium during a youth leadership conference, addressing a crowd of hundreds. "I was 6 years old when my honesty changed my life," she began. "But what I've learned since is that honesty doesn't just change your life, it can change the lives of everyone around you. We all have the power to do what's right, even when no one is watching. That's the legacy my mother taught me, and that's what I want to pass on." The room erupted in applause, and Thomas, sitting quietly in the front row, felt tears prick his eyes. Watching Jasmine speak, he realized his role in the story was ending, and hers was just beginning. As for Thomas himself, he had stepped back from day-to-day operations, spending more time mentoring young leaders and advising Diana. He had wealth, yes, but he now measured his life by something else entirely, the lives changed by one small act of courage. When journalists asked him about his success, he always said the same thing: "I was simply the witness." The real heroes were Diana and Jasmine. Meanwhile, Richard Blackwood had become a forgotten man. Time had not been kind to him. The arrogance that once defined him had eroded into bitterness. His health declined, his finances dwindled, and his name survived only as a cautionary tale in lectures and case studies. Students in business ethics classes often chuckled when his story came up, labeling him the man who lost everything to arrogance. On the rare occasions Richard saw Diana or Jasmine on television, he felt a pang of something he couldn't name: regret, jealousy, maybe even shame. But he never reached out. Deep down he knew any apology would mean nothing now. The world had moved on, and so had they. In contrast, Diana and Jasmine's world kept expanding. By Jasmine's senior year of high school, she had already secured admission to several top universities, with scholarships lining up from every corner of the country. She chose law, just as she had always said she would, determined to fight for those without a voice. On the night of her high school graduation, she stood on stage in her cap and gown, looking out into the audience. In the front row sat Diana, her eyes brimming with pride, and Thomas, his face lit with quiet joy. Jasmine smiled as she spoke her valedictorian speech. 10 years ago, my life could have gone in a very different direction. But one choice, choosing honesty, changed everything. I believe we all have those moments in our lives. Moments where the easy path tempts us, but the right path defines us. My mother taught me that character matters more than anything else. And I promise you this, I will carry that lesson into everything I do for the rest of my life. The audience rose to their feet in thunderous applause. Cameras captured the moment, and once again the story of Diana and Jasmine spread across the nation. Later that night, as the three of them sat together, Thomas turned to Jasmine. "You've grown into someone remarkable. I have no doubt you'll change this world more than I ever could." Jasmine grinned. "Mr. Thomas, I'm just getting started." And with that, the circle was complete. What began with a millionaire's quiet test of a maid's daughter had ended with a movement of honesty, justice, and opportunity that touched thousands. Diana's resilience, Jasmine's honesty, and Thomas's courage had built a legacy that no scandal, no prejudice, and no arrogance could ever undo. Richard Blackwood had been erased from relevance, his name remembered only as a warning. But Diana and Jasmine's names had become symbols of hope, integrity, and the power of choosing what's right. Subscribe to the channel to discover more stories that prove that doing good is always worth it, even when it seems impossible.